Good evening.
Good evening.
And I'm glad you're here. And we had a few technical difficulties with a laptop, so I rushed down the street to my office and brought mine up. So hopefully we're in good shape. If we experience a hiccup along the way, we'll work through it. Okay? So we appreciate your patience. Well, I'm here tonight, and I appreciate the Historical Society of Western Virginia having me to present about my most recent book, which is about Southwest Roanoke County. And what I want to do with you tonight is give you about a 10-cent history of Southwest Roanoke County, about 15 minutes, and then I'm hopefully going to show you a PowerPoint presentation of about 85 old pictures of the history of that particular section of Roanoke County. So I hope that that by the end of the presentation you'll have an appreciation for the history of Benton Mountain and Pope's Mill and Cave Spring and Starkey and what's all out to the west of us. Well, to begin the history of Southwest Roanoke County, one could begin some 225 years ago, when the very first Europeans began to settle in the section. Obviously, Native Americans had been present much earlier, but in 1730, the colonial governor of Virginia opened the Virginia frontier for settlement. And by 1740, we have the first recorded landowner in what is today Southwest Roanoke County, and that was Robert Poe. To understand better the context of these early settlers, we must keep in mind that in 1740, Southwest County was part of sprawling Augusta County, with the seat being in Stanton. The American Revolution was a quarter century in the future, and so really these earliest settlers along Back Creek, as you headed out towards Benton Mountain, were truly isolated and without protection. Most of the earliest settlers located along what was commonly called the Trader's Path, and that was a trail that led from central Virginia west and south into North Carolina. As its name implied, the trail was used for Europeans typically trading with Native Americans further west. Between 1740, when Poe and John Mason were reported as landholders, and the Revolution, there were at least two homesteading groups that came through the Back Creek and Benton Mountain sections. They probably originated in western Pennsylvania or from the northern Shenandoah Valley. Thus, by 1770, when Benton Mountain and Back Creek became part of the newly formed Bonatoc County, we find a number of land grants had been made in the section by that time. The presence of homesteads is further indicated by road building in the section. In 1772, John Bowman is commissioned to survey a road through the Back Creek area. And in that same year, Robert Poe, Leonard Huff, and James McKeechee are commissioned to survey a road from Tosh's Ford to the top of Benton Mountain. And then Joseph Willis and William Bell are hired to carry the same road survey from Benton Mountain to Bell's Mill on the Little River. Additional road surveys for the region were done in 1783 and 1784. Licenses to operate ordinaries were granted to David Willett and Lewis Harvey in the 1780s by Bonatoc County. During this period, Colonel Andrew Lewis, fourth son of General Andrew Lewis, erects Longwood, believed to be the first permanent home on Benton Mountain. Here, Lewis entertains prominent guests, as his first wife, Agatha Madison, was cousin to President James Madison. The guest list included European nobility, the Randolph and Lee families of Virginia, and from Longwood he corresponds with Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. Thus, we find a very active colonial era settlement developing in Benton Mountain and Back Creek. Upon Lewis's death in 1844, The estate was acquired by the Terry and Coles families. These two families developed an extensive tobacco operation at Bent Mountain, bringing with them tenant farmers and some slaves from their native Pennsylvania county. With the development of the agrarian economy of Southwest County, the Jacksonville and Bent Mountain Turnpike Company was chartered in 1832. And as some of you know, Jacksonville was basically what is today Floyd, the town of Floyd. The purpose was to take the early road that had been surveyed a half-century prior and develop it into a turnpike conforming to the set standards of width, grade, and bridge work. It took 15 years to raise the necessary capital and another 10 years to actually complete the turnpike, which was done in 1858. By the 1850s, we find regular mail service occurring through the Back Creek and Bent Mountain sections. The road's termini were Salem and Floyd Courthouse, and according to published reports of the 46-mile route, the mail ran once a week, either on Friday or Saturday, with 2 stops in Southwest County, Cave Spring and Bent Mountain. The Civil War period was one of upheaval and economic scarcity for those in Back Creek and Bent Mountain. There were fierce loyalties on both sides, splitting families. The Bottom Creek Gorge area and Floyd County became well-known havens for Confederate deserters and Union loyalists. In November 1862, John Peyton was scouting the Bent Mountain area for Confederate deserters. He had had some success because any found were taken to the jail over in Salem, which is where he was to deliver any that he found in and around Bent Mountain. Peyton emerged from a tavern at the foot of Bent Mountain after a midday meal, mounted his horse, and began his ascent. Well, the 65-year-old, 300-pound Peyton proved a slow target for men waiting in ambush. And near the top of Bent Mountain, Peyton was shot through the chest. His corpse was dragged some 80 yards into the woods, where it eventually was found. Colonel Andrew Dyerly was tasked with finding the culprits, and after making inquiries, eventually arrested James Stover. Stover's accomplice escaped. Stover was tried, convicted, and executed in Salem for killing Peyton. He was hung in a public ceremony at Salem in August 1863, near present-day Okies Field. And witnesses described the scene as Stover riding in the back of a buckboard perched atop his own coffin as the crowd followed to watch his death. Ironically and interestingly, the families of both Peyton and Stover used Elijah Pogue of Pogue's Mill to purchase their respective coffins. Bent Mountain and Back Creek did encounter the presence of federal troops in April 1865 when the 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry marched from Floyd Courthouse on their way to Salem. They camped one night on Bent Mountain before descending and arriving in Salem to find town leaders presenting a white flag of surrender. Following the war, George Woodruff planted the very first orchard at Back Creek in 1870. Woodruff's idea of orchards, rather than a typical farm of grains and livestock, was really met with skepticism. And as you can imagine, it's at the end of the war, and farmsteads are very economically deprived, and the idea of planting an orchard, which would not yield a harvest until 7 or 8 years after it was planted, was not something that people robustly embraced as a means of making a living. And so George Woodruff's enterprise was met with some fair amount of skepticism at first. But soon after Woodrum had planted his orchard, the Coles and Terry families discarded tobacco as their main crop and went into orchards themselves. By 1887, Mr. Kimball had erected a barrel factory at Pogue's Mill for shipping apples. And in 1890, the Roanoke and Southern Railway had erected a combination station in Starkey, allowing orchardists to ship apples to northern markets like Baltimore and New York. Thus, by the mid-1890s, the Salem Times-Register reported that Back Creek and Bent Mountain had gone from being what they deemed the poorest section of the county to the wealthiest section of the county, all due to apples. The change in the economy had prompted, according to the Salem Times-Register, a change in the people. In fact, the people of Bent Mountain and Back Creek had improved, the newspaper said, because of three things. And being a minister, I want to share with you these three things. Orchards, free schools, and the Bible. So that's what the Salem Times-Register. The Bent Mountain Apple and Cold Storage Company was incorporated in 1902. And over time, and with changing ownership, it would become the Back Creek Orchard Company. In 1903, the Pippin apple from Back Creek was chosen to represent Virginia at the St. Louis Exposition that year. That same year, brokers from New York took contracts on entire orchards in Southwest County for shipment to Europe. The Richmond Times-Dispatch, on a front page, declared Back Creek is the best apple section in all of Virginia. At an expo in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1911, apples from Back Creek were placed at President William Howard Taft's table for him to enjoy along with his entourage as part of their dinner. By 1915, brokers from New York had been replaced by brokers coming directly from Europe to bid on apple contracts with the locals. The orchardists were not only keen agriculturalists and businessmen, but they varied their business interests well beyond orchards to include mercantiles, barrel factories, real estate holdings, canneries, groceries. And in fact, the orchardists are primarily responsible for a couple of key things that happened in Back Creek and Bent Mountain, one of which were the telephone exchanges in 1910 and 1912. Now, I'll have to say to you, someone gave me a copy of the bylaws of the 1932 Bent Mountain Mutual Telephone Exchange. And anyway, when I first got a hold of it, I thought, well, I don't know, this might be kind of dry, boring stuff. But anyway, it was about a 15, 18 page kind of little pamphlet. So I started reading it. And you all know, from parents and grandparents, the switchboard operators always listened in on the call, right? The switchboard operators always listened in on the call. Well, according to the bylaws of the Bent Mountain Mutual Telephone Exchange, the switchboard operator was required to listen in on the call. And this is what I thought was so humorous, and it's in the book, but she, and they typically were ladies, she had certain guidelines she had to follow to which she had the authority to disconnect the phone call. So she could disconnect the phone call, and among some of the reasons were, for whatever reason, you could not play music through the telephone. So if she started hearing music, the call was disconnected. If in her estimation somebody was inebriated, she was to disconnect the call. If somebody used foul language, she could disconnect the call. And if she didn't follow those guidelines, that became grounds for dismissal. So I will share with you the 1932 32 bylaws of the Benton Mountain Mutual Telephone Exchange are really fascinating reading if you ever want to get a hold of. There were also two efforts to extend railways through Back Creek and Benton Mountain, and this was new information for me. In 1904, the Virginia-North Carolina Railway was chartered for the purpose of constructing an electric railway from Roanoke to Benton Mountain, then to Floyd, and terminating in Mount Airy, North Carolina. So confident were the investors that the Roanoke Times declared in a front page headline that year, quote, "Electric railway an assured fact." The Roanoke and Benton Mountain Railway was chartered in 1908, when the electric railway did not materialize. This new railway sought to create a steam railroad to follow basically the same path as the electric line. While neither materialized, both of these efforts underscore the wealth and kind of the industry of the orchards of that area. Pretty much what kind of dissolved the interest in those two railways was the erection and development of the combination station in Starkey, and so folks were able to, access rail at Starkey via the Roanoke Southern Railway. For the next 50 years, apples were king in Benton Mountain and Back Creek. The prominence of orchard operations helped convince the state to construct a true highway through Southwest County, Route 221, which they did with convict labor in 1932. And during World War II, German POWs housed in camps in Salem and Catawba worked the orchards of Southwest County. By the late 50s and early 60s, however, land became more valuable than the apples, and so developers sought to erect subdivisions in Back Creek, and thus the orchards began to go away, though some remained at Benton Mountain. My book, A History of Back Creek, seeks to capture in far more detail kind of what I've just outlined, but I also have individual chapters that are focused on particular slices of life in Benton Mountain and Back Creek, from education, social life, religion, small businesses. For education, the first documented school in Southwest County was in 1824. There is a schoolhouse noted on an 1864 map as being in Pope's Mill. And then by the 1870s, we have numerous one-room schoolhouses appearing throughout the section. And I've tried to document all of those little one-room schoolhouses using school board records and the recollections of folks out in Southwest County. The move away from the one-room log or frame structures to more substantive school facilities occurred in the late teens and 20s. Back Creek School, now not the one that you see today on 221, but you'll see a picture of it here in a minute, was built in 1912 with an auditorium added in 27. Starkey School was constructed, the brick Starkey School, in 1915. Benton Mountain School, which today is being used as a community center, was erected in 1915, followed by a brick structure in 1930. And then the present-day Back Creek Elementary School was first built in 1937. There is one school that I thought had particular interest, and that was the Mountaintop School, which served black children on Benton Mountain from 1929 through 1957. It is a Rosenwald school, and I think many of you are, I hope you are, you're familiar with the Rosenwald School. Julian Rosenwald was with the Sears Company, and he had this firm belief that the education of African American children was critical to the health and well-being and development of the United States. And so he would grant funds to at least help build schools, primarily in rural areas, for black children. Roanoke County has 3 Rosenwald schools, and anyway, one of those was Mountaintop School on Benton Mountain. As for small businesses, I've included the history of businesses that line Route 221 during the 20th century, from small groceries to canneries to garages. I also included brief histories of the Starkey iron ore mines, Roanoke gift shop atop Bent Mountain. Some of you may remember that. A few restaurants and some watering holes that were fairly popular. There was also a fairly structured social life. Mothers' clubs during World War I, to Knights of the Mystic Chain, lodges, right about the swimming pools, the Starkey Speedway, which some of you may know, some of you probably went to on occasion, but the Starkey Speedway hosted 4 NASCAR Cup races between 1958 and 62. Richard Petty won one of those. So these were guys whose names ultimately became legion within NASCAR racing. Baseball teams, organized baseball, goes back to 1907 with leagues and all out in that area. I also devote a chapter to the religious life of Southwest County through the histories of various congregations, some of which no longer exist, but those formal histories date back to as early as 1824 with the Laurel Ridge Church, in 1867 with Kidder Chapel. I described the pioneer ministers who went into the region, typically from churches in Salem. The arrival of Mormon missionaries in the 1880s, which was hugely controversial, And so anyway, over time, these congregations obviously shaped, reflected the values and the culture of the region. There's also a chapter on the positions, the early positions of Back Creek and Bent Mountain. We have Dr. Gale practicing at Cave Spring following the Civil War, who went on, of course, to form Lewis Gale Hospital. We also have Dr. Tinsley up on the mountain, up on Bent Mountain, who began his practice in the 1890s. He practiced for almost 50 years up there. We have midwives, who I talk about, and had the privilege to interview a lady whose great aunt, grandmother, served as midwives up on Bent Mountain. And then finally, and then we're going to get to some pictures, I have a chapter entitled, this is always good for marketing, Murder and Mayhem. If you buy the book, 9 out of 10 of you are going to immediately start with the last chapter, and then you'll swing back to maybe look at some of the others. But this really kind of becomes a catch-all to talk about some of the things in the history of Bent Mountain and Back Creek that are interesting, tragic, odd, unusual. And so I want to just share just a couple of those. Back in the 1880s and the 1890s, and this wasn't just in Bent Mountain and Back Creek, this was all over. If you had a family member that was suffering from mental illness or from age-related dementia, what did you do? Well, we kind of know what we do today, right? But what would you do? Well, one of the options that you had was to call upon the local or the area lunatic commission. That's what they were called. And the lunatic commission was 3 men, and these were not physicians, they weren't doctors, they tended to be justices of the peace or men who were just kind of respected in the larger community. And they would come out to the home, and they would visit with the family, they would interview the person the family had a concern about, and then the lunatic commission had the authority to commit you to, for that region, the asylum at Marion. Now, the fascinating thing is the activities and the visits and the reports of the lunatic commission were written up in the newspaper. So, just use me as an example, which I'm sure some of you think I would have been a candidate for such a visit. In the newspaper would say something like, Kathy Harris of Back Creek asked the Lunacy Commission to visit her home in regard to her husband, Mr. Nelson Harris. The Lunacy Commission made a visit to the Harris home this past Wednesday, where Mr. Harris is suffering from. And then they give a lengthy detail of what my issues were. And the Lunacy Commission decided to commit Mr. Harris to the asylum at Marion, and he is presently awaiting transport. That typically is the way an article would read. So I pulled a few of those out and put them in the book, just because, again, it's reflective of the way things kind of operate and occurred back in that time. We also have other things, you know, and many of you remember this, you know, the newspapers would have social columns. You know, typically they were pretty boring. Be who visited whom and who was sick and, you know, and all this kind of stuff. But every once in a while, the social columns would have really interesting stuff, like elopements. A daughter who wanted to marry some guy that her parents were just adamantly opposed to her marrying, and so they would elope, typically via the train in Starkey, is how they get out of town. We also have, in that last chapter, a few snippets about Prohibition agents who kept a watchful eye on the Starkey area primarily. If you're not familiar with Prohibition as it relates to Virginia, Virginia went dry 3 years ahead of national Prohibition. And so we had a pretty active little situation down in Starkey, primarily because of the train, what was coming in on it, or what was trying to be transported out on it. So a little bit of that is in there. So we got some moonshiners and that kind of thing. We have abandoned infants. It is really amazing how many records there are in the old newspapers about infants who were left on somebody's doorstep, typically somebody of means, and even though the Baptists and the Lutherans had orphanages here, you know, in Salem and that kind of thing, you know, back in the 1880s or 1890s or early 1900s, you know, it wasn't an easy thing to get over there quickly, and so many newborns ended up being left on somebody's doorstep, and ultimately then, you know, care would be provided and that kind of thing. So a little, you know, a few of those are kind of written up. I do give attention to two murders, however, in that chapter, for reasons that I hope you'll understand. One involves the murder of Zachariah Hayes by Marcus Hawley at Back Creek in 1880. Hawley is convicted, and his hanging in Salem becomes the last public execution in the county. Now, qualify that to say it's the last public execution. It's not the last execution, it's just the last public execution, public hanging that we have in Salem. And it was primarily due to the grotesque nature of what people ended up seeing. And, but because of both what happened and the trial, and it ultimately bringing an end to the public spectacle of executions, that is given significant treatment in the book. And then the other one occurs in 1929, and this is the murder of a young lady by the name of Frida Bolt. And Frida Bolt was a young lady from Floyd County. She is murdered by her boyfriend. It is a brutal event. It is really shocking and stunning to the folks of Bed Mountain and Back Creek. She is beaten, left in the woods on the side of Bed Mountain by her attacker. He thinks she has died. She has not. He comes back the next day and finishes the job. It's just brutal. It's brutal. But this is stunning. Her body is taken to the Back Creek Orchard Company, and until it can be picked up by the funeral home. The Carter family turned that murder into a fairly well-known bluegrass ballad in 1938. So that murder is given a little bit of treatment. So there's your kind of 10-cent history a little bit. And so what I want to do right now is take you through about 80 or 85 pictures. And the thing I want to say, just kind of by context, is this truly is people's shoeboxes and scrapbooks. I stationed myself at fire stations, at Civic League meetings, at Bent Mountain Community Center over a 2-year period, and through Facebook and the newspaper and word of mouth, let people know what I was doing, and invited them to bring whatever pictures they thought had some historic value in, and I would scan them. At the end of the process, I had made about 400 scans. So it was a lot of pictures. The publisher limited me to 100. So I cherry-picked what I thought were the better ones and the ones that had the broadest gave you the broadest visual of the history of Back Creek. So you're going to see some of those now. And, one of the things that I really enjoyed was a lot of people would bring out, oh, why that thing so light. I hope we have better luck with the lights than we did with them. Does that help? Yeah. A little bit. Anyway, it was amazing how many people had pictures of the old one-room schoolhouses out in Southwest County. And here's one, the old Hayron School. There were actually 3 different Hayron schools, and that sat near the intersection of 221 and Martins Creek Road, if you're familiar with Southwest County. Back Creek School 4-H Club in 1936. Here's the second Hayron School in 1917. And there's the Back Creek School that I talked about, that was the predecessor to the Back Creek Elementary School that most of us are familiar with now as you go out 221. And the building on the left is the structure that was built when the county began to consolidate the little one-room schoolhouses and bring folks into more substantive school buildings. The building on the right is the 1927 addition. That is no longer standing, but the building on the left still is, and it's a residence today on Landmark Circle. There's another one-room schoolhouse, Golden Ferguson School. Hayron Baptist Church in 1963, which is at the foot of Bent Mountain, and there's the original Hayron Baptist Church in 1924. Another thing that I talk about in the book are the kind of the social life that revolved around funerals and burials. As most of you know, in rural areas, the cemetery was on the family farm. And so typically, if somebody died on a Wednesday, unless it was late in the evening, the funeral would be the next day. It would occur in the home, with the burial then happening on the farm. And there was the tradition back in the day of families sitting up with the body overnight in the home. But these were very social occasions where neighbors would pitch in and help dig the grave. And then there would be a large dinner and all of this kind of thing. So this is actually a picture of a family burial out on Martins Creek Road back in the 1910s. This is Daniel Simpson and family in front of their home. And I tried to include some of these type photographs because I think they're really neat in that they show where people live and how people live. What I did not include in the book were posed photographs. And all of you know, you have photos of grandparents or whatever that obviously they've gone to a photo studio and one of them sitting in a wicker chair and the spouse has their hand gently resting upon the shoulder and whatnot. Those photos aren't in here. I wanted people outside. I wanted to see where they lived and how they dressed and all that kind of thing. And I would just add one thing. You know, this was a very personally rewarding experience for me because my family is from back on Back Creek in Benton Mountain. So this particular picture, the gentleman in the hat in the middle there is my great-grandfather, and the woman on his right, or on our right to him, is my great-grandmother, and the lady to the left of that man is my great-great-grandmother. So, this is Cave Spring Baptist Church. This church was where the Cave Spring Lions Club building is today. So if you're familiar with the brick Cave Spring Lions Club building, that's where Cave Spring Baptist Church was located. The Lions Club bought the church building back in the late 50s, early 60s. Met there for a while because Cave Spring Baptist had located where they are today, and then they raised that building in 62. Here's Back Creek School, 1917. Now that's the one that we saw just a little while ago, right? That had the schoolhouse and then the auditorium on the back side. And I just like pictures like this. You can kind of look and see how everybody dressed and all that kind of thing. Here is Pogue's store in 1910. Many of you are familiar with the name Elijah Pogue. Elijah Pogue started a mill out on Back Creek in the 1840s. He died in 1900. But near that mill, he had a store and warehouse, and that's what you're looking at in this photo. And even though by the time this photo is made, Elijah Pogue is deceased, it still continued to operate within the Pogue family. That house is still standing, and it's a residence today on Old Mill Road. But I love pictures like that because it's got the old car and, you know, people on horseback and all that good stuff. Here's Marvin Thatch Reed at his store in 1957. And if any of you grew up in Back Creek area, you certainly stopped at his store at some point in time. He was quite a fixture out there. His store was at the intersection there, Martins Creek Road, 221. Here's Ryerson's Grocery in 1970. So not everything is horse and buggy in the book. If you're familiar with Southwest County today, that is the Country Way store, just north of Back Creek Elementary School. Here's the Pogue's Mill Service Station. It's still there, but it's not. It's abandoned now. But I can remember stopping there many times. Here's just another great shot of just folks dressed as they would for a regular day. Alden Martin and his family in 1910. And I put a few homes in there just, again, so we could get a sense of how people lived and where they lived a century ago out in Back Creek and Benton Mountain. And you know, one of the things, and I love history as much as anybody else, but a lot of times when we're looking at a history, the only homes that ever make it in a history book are the brick mansions. And nobody lived in those, except, you know, just a narrow slice of people. Most folks lived in places like this a century ago. And so I wanted to just kind of give a little nod and a wink to those things. Pogue Farm on Route 221 in 1939. Again, the farmhouse, the farm is still operating out there in that location. You can see the little service station, the rock building right there along the creek, over on the right. First Mormon Chapel at Back Creek around 1900, also served as a little schoolhouse. Here's Back Creek Elementary School in 1953, and I've had a lot of people come up and tell me who they are in that picture. So it's big time. Are you in this picture?
First one on the left.
You're the first one on the left. And you know everybody in there who got in trouble. Oh. Did they all pass?
Yes, they did.
All right. All right. So you're on the front row on the left. Wow. There you go. You know you were going to be in a PowerPoint presentation tonight? All right. Glad you came. Back Creek School in '54. Of course, it's been remodeled and redone now. Here's Wheeler and Bessie Beckner at home in 1915. I put this picture in the PowerPoint for a couple reasons. Number one, there's a guy hanging out the window over there. And so obviously he wanted to get in his shot. And I have no idea who he is. And then, of course, we got some pristine hound dogs hanging around as well. The Little Rock Foundation. That's the house itself. They're on Cotton Hill Road, 1920. Here's Lucy Poe making apple butter in her home. Here's Kittinger Chapel. Kittinger Chapel is was one of the oldest congregations, the Kittinger congregation in the Back Creek area. It started right after the Civil War. It was a Union chapel at first. Methodists, Baptists, Brethren, Lutherans met there. Ultimately became a Lutheran congregation and was a Lutheran congregation until 1959. The church then, in my lifetime, was used basically for storage and has since been razed, but it was on Landmark Circle out on 221. Here's Bell's Store and Telephone Exchange in 1910. That's where the switchboard was for the Fruit Growers Telephone Exchange in Back Creek. This Holt Store up on Bent Mountain. I'll have a better picture of that here in just a moment. Here's C.F. Holt in his store. And again, I just like pictures like this because it shows, you know, the storekeeper and some of the merchandise and all behind him and kind of what the store looked like. Again, this is shoebox and scrapbook material. Now, here's the better shot of Holt's store on Bent Mountain. Holt's store is the structure on the far left. The house in the middle was owned by the Holts, and they boarded doctors, physicians on Bent Mountain there after Dr. Tinsley had passed away. So for a lot of folks back in the 30s and 40s, that's where they would go to see the doctor. It's Mount Olivet Baptist Church. That's the structure as it was built back in the 30s. Then Mountain School marble players, 1945. A lot of you know that marbles was big time back in the 40s. We had city county championships and whatnot. And I was sitting at home one night. You know, it doesn't take much to entertain me. And I was Googling Bent Mountain and just seeing what would come up. And it showed up in the New York Times, Bent Mountain. And I thought, oh, well, what happened on Bent Mountain that got the attention of the New York Times? And it was because some little boy from Bent Mountain was the state marble champion and was heading to New Jersey for the National Marble Tournament. And so, anyway, apparently they had it going on up there. Reed Store at Heron in 1942. Expanded in 49. Bellevue Primitive Baptist Church in 1965. This sits on Roselawn Road, and today is a residence. Here's Hezekiah Lavender and his family out in front of their home in 1910. This home is still standing. If you know where Bridlewood subdivision is, as you go into the subdivision, there's a white farmhouse off to the right, and that's that house. Hezekiah Lavender was a school teacher, amongst other things, and he left some notes about teaching school back at the turn of the last century. And he said that he had about 25, 26 students, and they ranged in age from 4 to 21. One room. So I posted a few of these, like that one, on Facebook, and I put in the comment, I say, "This house is still standing." And I posted up, "This house is still standing." And so finally somebody responded back and said, "I need to talk with that carpenter. I need that carpenter. That's who I need to look up." We had a Back Creek baseball team, and a guy named Ralph Henry, and he was very helpful in my project. It says Spinell's on the front. That's just because Spinell's store happened to be the one that sponsored the team that year. And the Salem History Museum actually has a uniform from the 50s. Team that year happened to be sponsored by Reed's store. And while just the jersey is shown there, the Back Creek baseball team in that particular era had a jersey with red letters, blue pinstripe, pants to match, socks to match. So if they didn't play good, at least they looked good.